so they can engage with their people. Okay, so we are shortly going to start our sessions. The first session we have today is with Gethin Nadin, who is Director of Employee Wellbeing at Benefex. And then after that, we're going to hear from Dr. Adrian Heisler, who's Chief Medical Officer at Helix International. Then it's up with Ryan Tamasibi. I think I got that right this time, Ryan. Director of People Science at Hive. And our final presentation today is going to be from Andy Britt, who's Vice President at IBM Global Business Services. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to pass over to Gethin.
Okay, hopefully that was pretty seamless. Can everybody see that screen?
Yep.
Okay, perfect, excellent. So what I'm going to talk about today, the coronavirus experience has affected us all differently. So there's this great quote that's been going around on social media about we're all in the same storm, but we're in different boats. And I think we need to be able to deliver the best employee and wellbeing experiences. And to be able to do that, we must start to personalize them. We know that not everyone is having the same life experience. So we've got to stop treating people the same. And the return to work following lockdown is going to see a hell of a lot more anxiety and poorer mental health. So it's never been more important for us to design experience for the needs of each individual employee. Just before we kind of get started, a little bit about me. I wrote a lot about HR and wellbeing for lots of different magazines and kind of consumer news as well. I'm the co-chair and a founding member of the Engage Success Thought Action Group on Wellbeing. That's a group of experts come together to help UK organisations develop better wellbeing strategies. I'm also the founding member of the Initiative for Financial Wellbeing and listed as an employee experience expert by lots of different organisations. Last year, I also won the Global Employee Engagement Influencer Award, so one of the top 100 global employee engagement influencers. And I wrote a book called A Word of Good, which went on to the Amazon HR bestseller list in the UK and went on to win an award as well. And this is really where I started to look at employee experience design and how important that was. And actually, I narrowed that down to well-being as an incredibly important part of that experience. And so that's really where my focus is at the moment, is the broad employee experience and how well-being plays a significant part of that. And if anyone wants to contact me on kind of social media following this event, I'll pick a few of you out and send some copies of the book to you if you're interested in that. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about before we kind of get started, and appreciate I've got a very short amount of time to kind of go through this, and this is usually an hour-long presentation. So if I skip over some things and you want a bit more information, you can find me or Benefex online and just ask us those questions, and we'll give you the answers to those. Whenever we have an experience at work, we are designing that. And I think what we need to get HR and organization to think about is how we are designing that experiences. Experiences are critical to how we view work because they determine how fondly we recall things. So, for example, was my time at work a positive or a frustrating experience? And we see this quite a lot with things like onboarding, where we create some awful experiences by letting anxious employees wait for weeks on end before we hear back from them after an interview, that kind of stuff. And generally, from my experience, as an example, the whole interview process is really badly designed. People turn up in clothes they don't usually wear, or they act a way they wouldn't be expected to wear, and they kind of deliver rehearsed stories of customer service, etc. And so I think that's, there's some really good examples of bad design when it comes to employee experiences. But we've also, one of the fundamental rules of the good design is we need to think about how people use it, and we need to make sure that the experiences we have at work are easy to use. Good design is intuitive. We can expect things to work a certain way. So in product design, things like doors with a handle open towards us, steering wheel spin to the right. So there's a natural order of things we expect things to work. And whenever we think about good design at work, it's generally brilliant in its simplicity. As humans, we shy away from complex design, so we don't like to have to think too much. This is called natural mapping, and it's about alleviating the cognitive load that somebody has when they use things like technology, for example, so the technology we use at work. So, for example, things like we expect the green button to symbolize yes or enter or go, and a red to indicate stop or cancel. So as well as ensuring we understand that there's a human at the end of the experience, we also need to ensure that our experiences at work are meaningful. And sometimes this means we need to be honest with ourselves about the frustrations that employees are facing and get to the bottom of what those employees really want from those experiences. And there's a great story about Harvard professor Theodore Levitt, who famously once said that people don't want to buy a quarter-inch drill, they want to make a quarter-inch hole. But in reality, we can probably dig a bit deeper into that and see that if the hole in the wall is required for a shelf to hold books, then the real problem in this example is that we've got nowhere to put our books. So good designers don't try to solve the problem given to them. They start to try and understand what the real issues are. And you've probably heard of this called design thinking. And it's an easy way for HR to apply it to developing employee experience and well-being strategies and ask themselves lots of questions about, what are we actually trying to do? And a really good way of doing that is asking yourself 5 questions as to why are we doing this? So when you're rolling out a well-being initiative, why are we doing this? Why do we think this will be a good thing and all that kind of stuff? And at Benefex, we talk about this generally as employee experience loops. So designed by our CEO, Matt Macriola, we think about those small interactions we have at work as being the loops, and kind of looking at those small or big loops, collectively you start to improve the employee experience. And so the example we see on screen is kind of a conversation somebody had online with Google, where you ask Google to remember this location. They said, okay, I remember that. Then when you ask it again, what did you ask it to remember? It just remembers, you told me this location. Kind of really frustrating experience. And technology dominates our employee experience at work, and it's dominating the well-being experience. And so when we think about technology design, we're starting to think about how easy is it for us to use? How frustrated do we get when it doesn't work the way we expect it to? And I'm sure we all experience this with our smart speakers at this moment while we're in the kind of early stages of development of that kind of product. And what we tend to see with technology is this kind of paradox of technology, as it's called, where providers will add feature after feature to kind of justify the cost of technology. But actually what you start to see is that actually convolutes the whole process and makes it more difficult to use. And what we can see in the workplace is, people use so many bits of experience now, and we're starting to see well-being become part of that experience, that you're just starting to kind of really overload people. And so we've got, as an industry, as a HR technology industry, we've been really guilty to add to the overload that employees are facing in the employee experience, and now are facing the same thing in employee experience, employee well-being experience. We've met clients in the past couple of months who've had crazy amounts of systems. So we had one client recently with about 22,000 employees in 4 countries. They had 1 email system, 4 collaboration platforms, 3 chat platforms, and they were now looking at what bits of well-being and mindfulness technology and occupational health they could start adding to that. So what we found is immediately for their employees just to do their job, they have to access more than 7 different platforms. And as we start to dig into that a bit deeper, we can start to see that actually that overload is even worse. So we can see that we have systems for payroll, reward and benefits, perks, shares, time and attendance, onboarding. And some research we did a couple of years ago at Benefex found that the average figure is about 28 different systems to be able to do the job, and half of those are in HR. And it's almost like, we talked about Netflix at the start of this call. Imagine if Netflix didn't suggest content to you and instead just gave you a list of the thousands of films they've got. Or imagine if you had to log into separate systems if you wanted to view films from Disney or Universal or Paramount. We just wouldn't do it. We make that so difficult. And we know from consumer research that even asking a consumer to create an online account sees 30% of people abandon their shopping carts. So those small little barriers we're putting in the way are reducing our ability to have a great experience, but also our ability to want to use things like the new bits of wellbeing technology. So we've kind of got to find a better way to reach people and grab their attention. And I think we can do that by designing things better and how we surface that information to employees. And what you can see on the screen at the moment, these are just some of the logos that you'll see in the UK at the moment as wellbeing emerges as that significant part of the employee experience. So what we're starting to see is we've got this whole new load of wellbeing kind of overload that we're throwing on top of what people are already experiencing. And one of the primary things we discovered in our research with King's College London and my involvement in the EFS Wellbeing Thought Action Group was that employers and employees are really confused by everything we're throwing at them. And so it's really important when you think about wellbeing at work and employee experience that we aren't continually just adding by throwing multiple bits of technology without thinking about how these things work together. we really need to think about the fatigue involved in accessing multiple systems. And it's a big problem, and it sees a lot of investment wasted. So I think that's a really important part of the experience for us to think about at the moment. And when we think about well-being and employee experience, what we're starting to see is these really rapidly changing attitudes to well-being in the workplace. So some of the headlines that have kind of hit their headlines in the UK, in particular over the last few months pre-coronavirus, we started to see that well-being was going to become this really big priority for CEOs and HR teams right across the country. We even saw politicians and mayoral candidates being urged to prioritise workers' health and well-being. And you've probably seen some other examples in the news as well, where governments now start to look at, actually, is GDP a really good way of us measuring how successful a country is, and should we be looking at the individual's well-being, and actually should that be a guiding milestone for what we do? And the UK has been looking at that. We know New Zealand's kind of leading the charge on that. But as we start to kind of get into this new area of well-being, and we are still really in its infancy, we're starting to see quite a few challenges. And last year, a study published in JAMA, a medical journal in the US, looked at the experiences of 33,000 workers at BJ's Wholesale Club, a retailer in the US, over a year and a half, one of the biggest workplace wellbeing studies ever taken place. And while workers who enrolled in the wellness program reported that they'd learned to exercise more and watch their weight, the research found that there were actually no significant differences in outcomes like lower blood pressure, sugar levels, or other health measures. And it found no significant reduction in workers' healthcare costs, which is obviously a big reason behind workplace wellbeing in the US in particular. And that study randomly assigned employees to a wellness program and compared their results to those people who were not enrolled in such efforts. But one thing they did find is that some disengaged employees had started to take the first and important steps towards looking at improving their own wellbeing. Employees have frequently recorded that, saying they feel pressurized by their employer to take part in wellbeing, and that it's not being well received is a reason why they don't get involved in workplace wellbeing. And the research has actually found that employers would see the most benefit from trying to change behavior rather than focus entirely on reducing health spend. And I think that's something really important for us to think about. Another big study about workplace wellbeing that came out last year was by the University of Chicago. Public policy associate professor, a gentleman called Damon Jones, along with the University of Illinois faculty members, designed this workplace wellbeing study. And they randomized 12,500 individuals, divided them into control group and treatment group. And they found that virtually no difference in health spend between the control group and the treatment group. There was no significant difference in sick leave. There was no significant difference in salary or job separation. And in fact, gym visits were nearly identical between the two groups, and there was no real difference in any kind of running clubs or participation in running events. And all that data we gathered kind of across those two really big studies that came out in the US last year, they kind of tell us that most workplace wellbeing fails because it's not designed for the right person. Most workplace wellbeing initiatives fail because they're designed for the workplace, not the worker. So two of the biggest workplace wellbeing studies we've ever seen tell us largely the same thing, that we must design wellbeing for the employee, not for the employer. And that kind of takes me on to my final point, and that is, how do we do that? How do we design for an audience of one? As consumers, we expect a personalized experience at work. We get that from Amazon and Netflix and LinkedIn. Those of you who are on the call that have ever designed a product or a customer journey will be familiar with the idea of designing for a target audience. And that's easy when you're building a product aimed at a specific demographic, such as teenagers or new parents. But it's much more difficult when we're designing for experiences for a diverse workforce full of different genders, races, ages, cultural backgrounds, different educations, different motivations, etc. So we don't have a target consumer within our workforce, which means the experiences we deliver shouldn't be inherently personalized to that individual. And after all, there's no such thing as an average employee. If you kind of look at an average employee and you averaged out left-handers and right-handers, what do you end up with? Averages don't really work. And so personalizing that employee experience is a really, really important part of how do we create better well-being in the workplace. And as employers, I think we've got to the point where we believe that the fair thing to do is to treat everybody the same, but employees are different. They have different needs and wants and need different support. We've seen during coronavirus that not employees are being affected the same way. In the UK, 1 in 8 people don't have gardens. Some people don't have safe homes. Others have swimming pools and lots of room. You are significantly more likely to not have an outdoor space if you are a Black employee or a person of colour. And so you think about what's going on in the world and how we're trying to change ourselves to become more anti-racist. We need to really think about how we design well-being experiences for everybody rather than just an average employee. And for a long time in employee benefits, we made sweeping assumptions about what different generations wanted from a benefit scheme, for example. So we assumed that employees' lives they followed a set cycle of marriage, starting a family, retirement, when in reality there are fewer marriages and births than we've ever had before, and people are working for longer and working into retirement lives. They're starting families later in life, and many are delaying house buying till their kind of 30s and 40s. So demographics and personas are out the window, and we can't design workplace experiences for groups of people anymore. We have to view our audience as one person. So it's become incredibly useful for us to design employee and wellbeing experiences with that design thinking in mind. And that enables us to embrace our employees' beliefs, trust and belonging that they have in their workplace. And that design thinking helps us to identify small loops of frustration and annoyances that can be quickly resolved to create more positive experiences at work. And I think this thinking also helps us make sure that any technology that we're purchasing, whether that be for the employee experience or well-being, is going to achieve what we want it to achieve and ultimately deliver meaningful experiences for our employees. So appreciate that's a very whistle-stop tour through kind of design thinking and design those employee experiences. But I think as we start to get our employees to go back to work, we must learn from what's happened over the last 3 months. And we've realized more than ever that the individual circumstances a person has and how much their well-being relies on those circumstances means we have to design those experiences for the individuals and stop looking at averages and a wider group. So I'm now going to pass over to our next speaker, Dr.